The Forgotten Passenger. Scene 1. The night shift begins. It was late, and the streets were empty, just as Mark liked them. The soft hum of the car's engine was the only
Same old routine. Pick up, drop off, go home.
He turned onto a narrow, deserted street, the streetlights flickering as he passed them. The GPS on his phone buzzed, signaling a new ride request. Mark glanced at the screen, a location in the far outskirts of the city, a place he rarely drove to.
Outskirts? At this hour?
He hesitated for a moment, then accepted the request. Money was money, after all. But something about the location felt off. He shook his head, pushing the feeling aside.
Just a quick ride. Get in, get out. Easy.
As he drove toward the destination, the buildings became sparser, and the road turned darker. The streetlights were fewer now, and the trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, casting long shadows across the street. Scene 2. The Passenger. As Mark approached the pickup location, the GPS on his dashboard started glitching, the screen flickering briefly before returning to normal. He squinted at the address. It was an old, almost forgotten part of town, far from the usual routes. The street was dark and empty. No lights, no signs of life, only the faint outline of a building in the distance. Mark pulled the taxi to a stop at the exact location the GPS indicated. He turned off the engine and looked around. The air outside was still, unnervingly quiet.
This doesn't feel right.
He glanced at the rearview mirror, and for a moment, his breath caught in his throat. A figure was standing just beyond the car's headlights. A woman, dressed in an old-fashioned coat and scarf, her face obscured by shadows. She hadn't been there a second ago.
All right, just a regular passenger.
He unlocked the doors with a soft click, and the woman slowly made her way to the car, her movements almost mechanical. The cold air from outside rushed in as she opened the back door and sat down without a word. Mark adjusted the mirror to get a better look at her, but her face remained hidden in the darkness of the back seat.
Evening. Where are you headed?
The woman remained silent for a moment, then handed him a small, crumpled note. Mark hesitated before taking it. The note simply had an address, one he didn't recognize, in the farthest part of town. Scene 3. The Uneasy Ride. As the taxi rolled forward, the silence inside the car grew heavier with each passing moment. Mark tried to shake off the uneasy feeling settling in his chest, but the woman's presence behind him felt more oppressive with every turn of the wheels. The address on the crumpled note she gave him was somewhere he had never been, deep in a part of the city that no one talked about anymore.
What is she doing out here? And why this old address?
He glanced in the rearview mirror again. The woman sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She hadn't moved since she got in the car, and her face was still obscured by shadows. Mark cleared his throat, hoping to break the tension.
So, strange night, huh? You don't see many people out this late, especially in this part of town.
No response. The woman remained silent, her eyes fixed straight ahead, as if she hadn't even heard him. Mark's knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. The streetlights flickered as they passed, casting long, dancing shadows inside the car. The further they drove, the darker the road became, until the only light came from the car's dim headlights. The GPS on the dashboard began to glitch again, the route disappearing and reappearing on the screen.
It's just an old GPS. Nothing to worry about.
But something in his gut told him otherwise. The air inside the taxi felt colder now, and a strange sensation crept over him, the feeling of being watched, even though he was the one driving. Mark's eyes darted back to the rearview mirror, expecting to see the woman's face this time, but instead, her reflection wasn't there at all. His heart skipped a beat.
What the?
Scene 4. The passenger speaks. Mark's heart raced as his mind tried to make sense of what he had just seen, or rather, what he hadn't seen. The passenger was still sitting behind him, yet her reflection was completely absent from the rearview mirror. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, his palms sweating.
No reflection. That's not possible.
He dared to glance over his shoulder, but the woman remained motionless in the back seat, her face still hidden in the shadows. The flickering streetlights cast strange patterns across her figure, making her appear almost unreal. Suddenly, she shifted, just slightly, enough to break the oppressive silence.
You're almost there.
Mark felt a chill run down his spine at the sound of her voice. It was low, emotionless, as though it didn't belong to a living person. He glanced down at the GPS again, but the screen was still glitching, offering no guidance.
Where exactly are we going?
The woman didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand, pointing toward the road ahead. Mark followed the gesture with his eyes. In the distance, barely illuminated by the car's headlights, he saw an old, run-down building hidden behind a wall of trees.
Is this your destination?
The woman nodded slowly, her face still obscured. The building was almost completely hidden from view, as if it had been forgotten by time. There was something deeply unsettling about it, but Mark couldn't put his finger on why. The car approached the turnoff, and the GPS blinked back to life for a brief moment, displaying the words "You've arrived." Scene 5. The arrival. The taxi slowly rolled to a stop in front of the old, crumbling building. The headlights barely illuminated the front steps, which were overgrown with weeds and covered in years of neglect. The air outside the car felt unnaturally cold, sending chills through Mark's body even though the windows were closed. He stared at the building, unease washing over him. Something about this place didn't feel right. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong in the present. The past clung to it like a thick fog.
What kind of place is this?
He glanced in the rearview mirror again. The woman was still sitting there, motionless, staring straight ahead at the building. The shadows seemed to wrap around her, making her seem like part of the darkness itself. Mark's hand hovered over the door handle, but something inside him screamed not to get out.
This is your stop?
The woman didn't answer, but she slowly turned her head toward him, her eyes still hidden in shadow. Her cold, emotionless voice finally broke the silence.
You're coming with me.
Mark's heart skipped a beat. His hand froze on the door handle. He turned to face her fully, his breath shallow.
What?
Without another word, the woman opened her door and stepped out of the car. Mark could hear the crunch of gravel under her feet as she slowly walked toward the building, disappearing into the darkness. He sat frozen in the driver's seat, his mind racing.
What the hell is happening? Do I follow her? Do I leave?
The car felt like a cage, trapping him between the fear of the unknown and the impossibility of escape. His instinct screamed to drive away, but his body refused to move. The dark building loomed ahead, and the woman was nowhere to be seen. Scene 6. The choice. Mark sat frozen in the driver's seat, his breath shallow and his heart pounding. The passenger's words echoed in his mind, "You're coming with me." It wasn't a request, it felt like a command, one that wrapped around him like cold chains. His hand was still hovering over the door handle, but he couldn't bring himself to move. The eerie silence of the night pressed in on him, and the old, crumbling building loomed ahead, half hidden in shadows. The passenger had already disappeared into the darkness, her figure swallowed by the night. But the feeling she'd left behind, something darker than fear, clung to Mark's every thought.
I should leave. I should drive away. What if she's dangerous? What if I don't make it back?
The thought of leaving almost brought a sense of relief, but something else was gnawing at him, a sense of curiosity, or maybe it was dread. He didn't know which. The old building looked as if it had been abandoned for decades, but it also seemed to be waiting for him.
This is insane. Why would I follow her?
He turned the key in the ignition, ready to start the car and leave this nightmare behind. But the engine sputtered, then went silent. Mark's blood ran cold. He tried again, but the car refused to start. Panic flared up inside him.
Come on! Come on! Not now!
He slammed his hands on the steering wheel in frustration, but it was useless. He was stuck. The oppressive silence outside the car seemed to grow thicker, like the night was closing in on him. Mark's phone buzzed on the dashboard, making him jump. He glanced at it, his heart still racing. There was a new notification from the GPS.
Walk to destination.
Mark stared at the screen, disbelief flooding him. The GPS had never displayed anything like that before. His hand trembled as he reached for the door handle. He knew what he had to do, but every fiber of his being screamed not to. With a deep breath, Mark opened the car door. The cold air hit him like a wave, but he stepped out into the darkness, his eyes locked on the old building ahead. There was no going back now. His feet crunched on the gravel as he took slow, hesitant steps toward the building. The air was colder now, almost suffocating. The shadows ahead seemed to stretch toward him, welcoming him into their grasp. He hesitated for just a moment, looking back at the car, the only familiar thing in this nightmare. But something told him that turning back wasn't an option anymore.
What's inside? And why do I feel like I already know?
And just as he reached the first step, a chilling thought crossed his mind. What if this isn't the end, but the beginning? Want to know what's waiting for Mark inside? You're not alone. Make sure you're subscribed, or you might miss what happens next.